Hi everyone, my name is Samantha Hill and I am the Assistant Director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Welcome to our virtual reading group. This week we are discussing Hannah Arendt's essay, Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship, which you can find in this wonderful edited volume by Jerome Kohn, Responsibility and Judgment. We'll be reading another essay from here at our next meeting as well. So let me just start by saying a couple of words about the essay and then walk you through a couple of the key turns that Arendt is going to make and draw out a few of the key passages. So she wrote this essay in 1964, and she starts by contextualizing it in the controversy that was touched off by Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. And she says a lot of the controversy that happened sprung up around the book was actually responding to a book that was never written, which for her raised a series of questions, one of which is what were people actually responding to? And she's going to argue that people were responding to what they were angry about, in part, was that she was making a judgment about Eichmann as a man, as a person in the world. And so if we look at on page 18 near the beginning of the essay, she says, "Finally, and in a way most surprisingly, since after all we dealt with a trial whose result invariably was the passing of judgment, I was told that judging itself is wrong. No one can judge who had not been there." This, incidentally, was Eichmann's own argument against the district court's judgment. When told that there had been alternatives and that he could have escaped his murderous duties, he insisted that these were post-war legends born of hindsight and supported by people who did not know or had forgotten how things had actually been. So one of the questions that Arendt lays before us is the question of judgment, and the question of judgment in relationship to morality and the question of judgment in relationship to legality, legal issues. This is an incredibly dense essay, I think, but there's a real payoff at the end, as there often is in Arendt's writing. She's going to eventually lead us to the relationship between judgment and thinking, and her particular definition of thinking as that conversation that I have with myself when I'm alone. And in order to get there, she's going to start by parsing out the title of the essay, Personal Responsibility versus Political Responsibility and Judgment. How is it that we form judgments, and how are we taught to form moral judgments about the world around us and how we decide what to do or what not to do? So in the first part of the essay, Arendt is going to talk about the ways in which we are made to feel uncomfortable when confronted with moral judgments, which is what she in part sees happening in response to her reportage on Eichmann. What is the language we use to talk about moral judgments about individual character? So she reflects that in her youth, these questions of moral judgment were not so readily apparent. They were taken for granted, she says, but that her generation, beginning in 1933, was confronted with the necessity of thinking about questions of morality. So on page 23 she writes, "At the time the horror itself in its naked monstrosity seemed not only to me but to many others to transcend all moral categories and to explode all standards of jurisdiction. It was something men could neither punish adequately nor forgive. And in this speechless horror, I fear, we all tended to forget the strictly moral and manageable lessons we had been taught before, and would seem to be taught and would be taught again in innumerable discussions both inside and outside of courtrooms." And so here she's reflecting upon the breakdown of her early education in moral questions. One of the important arguments that she lays out in this text, I think very clearly, is that the phenomenal appearance of a totalitarian society, in addition to a totalitarian regime in the 20th century, led to a complete collapse of the normative moral order. and the normative legal order, in the sense that we would generally conceive of it as being in tandem with a moral order, right? Eichmann is not simply a cog in a machine who doesn't bear any personal responsibility for the decisions he made, but the decisions he made were a question of personal judgment. So Arendt returns to her personal reflections in order to pose the question, how can you think, she asks, how can you think, and even more important in our context, how can you judge without holding on to preconceived standards, norms, and general rules under which the particular cases and instances can be subsumed? Or, to put it differently, what happens to the human faculty of judgment when it is faced with occurrences that spell the breakdown of all customary standards and hence are unprecedented in the sense that they are not foreseen in the general rules, not even as exceptions from the rules? What is at stake in personal responsibility? What is personal responsibility? And she argues that we have to begin to think about personal responsibility in contradistinction to political responsibility. So she's going to say in one way or another, we all can take on a sense of political responsibility. We are all born into the world, which has order and society and culture and a system of law that we participate in, right? And so in one way or another, we all bear the sins of our fathers. She uses that language, as opposed to personal responsibility, right? And here she starts to interrogate how the collapse between a sense of personal responsibility, moral responsibility, and political responsibility were conflated under and after the Nazi regime. She said there was this phenomenon that happened in Germany where people who had done nothing said that they felt guilty, right? That they felt guilty for what had happened. But she says you can't take responsibility for something that you haven't actually done, and that when you try and do so, it creates a state of moral confusion. On page 29, she says, there's no such thing as collective guilt or collective innocence. Guilt and innocence make sense only if applied to individuals. And so here she starts to transition into the heart of her argument about Eichmann and the question of personal responsibility under dictatorship within this essay. And she's going to lay out what she calls the Cog Theory from about pages 29 to 32 in this edition. What is the role of responsibility for functionaries who perform a specific role or job within a system, within a bureaucracy, within a complex governmental structure? And this was one of Eichmann's defenses, which was predictable, that was used at trial, that he could not be held responsible for what he specifically had done because he was simply playing this part in a bigger system. He was a cog. Anybody could have replaced him. And so it was a kind of accident of history that he wound up in the courtroom and not somebody else by the nature of the political structure. And Arendt is going to reject this defense. And she says that on 32, she says, Eichmann's trial would not have been as interesting to anyone if he had been merely a cog. He was also a man. He was a person who made personal choices and decisions. So when we have a cog system and a man performing a role in a cog system, then now how do we talk about personal responsibility? How do we talk about the system, the structure of government? And so I'm gonna slide over this part, but the next few pages she's going to draw a distinction between dictatorship and totalitarian forms of government in order to talk about how a totalitarian society leads to a state of total domination, which reaches into all realms of life, not just the political spheres of life. She says totalitarian society is monolithic. Everything in a totalitarian society is subservient to the totalitarian's ruling principles, so that anyone who participates in public life is going to be implicated in the deeds and the actions of the regime, right? So anybody who participates in public life is complicit in what the totalitarian regime is doing. So in other words, right, the crimes were legal within totalitarian regimes. And this is a turn that she's making in order to emphasize the importance of personal responsibility and how individual understandings of morality affect the way that we make decisions about how we act in the world. So if you live in an unjust society, in a totalitarian society, and you participate in that society as a citizen, as a subject, then you are implicitly going along with, implicated in that regime, right? And the source of the moral confusion, then, is that even if what you're doing is wrong, it's legal, right? You are just being a good, active participant in the system. But that doesn't mean that it's right just because it's legal. And so she says this poses considerable problems in regard to the question of responsibility. She says, for the simple truth of the matter is that only those who withdrew from public life altogether, who refused political responsibility of any sort, could avoid becoming implicated in crimes. That is, could avoid legal and moral responsibility. And so at the bottom of page 35, she's going to begin a conversation about standards of moral judgment and the rhetoric of the lesser of two evils. What do we do when we're confronted with two evils and we don't have a clear moral decision to make? The argument tells us that we have a duty to opt for the lesser of two evils, and that it's irresponsible to choose altogether. It's irresponsible to not choose. But the reality, she says, is that when we choose the lesser of two evils, we forget that we're still choosing evil, right? And she argues that this acceptance of the lesser evil is consciously used in conditioning by government officials in order to get citizens to go along with regimes, right? And so here she is drawing a distinction between moral and legal standards of judgment. What happens when the legal standards of judgment require you to participate in a corrupt system, right? Complicates the usual standards of moral judgment when the legal system destroys the moral categories that we use in order to determine what is right or wrong. So then how do individuals decide how to act in a world that is evil? On page 39, she writes, what neither the political reason of state theory nor the legal concept of acts of state foresaw was the complete reversal of legality. In the case of the Hitler regime, the whole state machinery enforced what normally are considered criminal activities, to put it mildly. There was hardly an act of state which, according to normal standards, was not criminal. Hence, it was no longer the criminal act which, as an exception to the rule, supposedly served to maintain the rule of the party in power. Right? So Arendt then cuts to the point of the moral matter, which is at hand on page 42, writing, for the moral point is never reached by calling what happened by the name of genocide, or by counting the many millions of victims. Extermination of whole peoples had happened before in antiquity, as well as in modern colonization. It is reached only when we realize that this happened within the framework of legal order, and that the cornerstone of this new law consisted of the command, "Thou shalt kill." Not thy enemy, but innocent people who were not even potentially dangerous. And not for any reason of necessity, but on the contrary, even against all military and other utilitarian considerations. The killing program was not meant to come to an end with the last Jew to be found on Earth, and it had nothing to do with the war except that Hitler believed he needed a war as a smokescreen for his non-military killing operations. Those operations themselves were intended to continue on an even more grandiose scale in time of peace. And these deeds were not committed by outlaws, monsters, or raving sadists, but by the most respected members of respectable society. Finally, it must be realized that although these mass murderers acted consistently with a racist or anti-Semitic, or at any rate a demographic ideology, the murderers and their direct accomplices more often than not did not believe in these ideological justifications. For them, it was enough that everything happened according to the will of the Führer, which was the law of the land, and in accordance with the words of the Führer, which had the force of law. To tease that out a little and go back to a part I skipped over at the beginning, here Arendt is really emphasizing the personal nature of the choices that are made under totalitarian regimes that are legal by their very nature, but come in conflict with what it is we know to be right or wrong morally when we take the time to have a conversation with ourselves and to think about what it is that we as individuals are willing to live with. It's one thing to want to blame the whole of history for the emergence of totalitarianism as a phenomenon in the 20th century, which is in part what she sees the Eichmann trial trying to do. It's another to look at the individuals who participated in the Holocaust and in German society at that time, and to think about why they made the decisions that they made. And so here at the end of the essay, she returns to the question of personal responsibility. She asks, first, in what way were those few who did not go along with, who were outlaws, right? Were those few different, who in all walks of life did not collaborate and refused to participate in public life, though they could not and did not rise in rebellion? So what was different about people who did not just go along with? And second, if we agree that those who did not serve on whatever level and in whatever capacity were not simply monsters, Eichmann wasn't a raving lunatic monster, right? What was it that made them behave as they did? Why did Eichmann make the decisions that he made, for example? And on what moral, as distinguished from legal grounds, did they justify their conduct after the defeat of the regime and the breakdown of the new order with its new sets of values? So she says the first question is straightforward, and she says those who did not participate were the only people who dared to judge themselves, right? It's a question of personal judgment. And they were capable of doing so not because they disposed of a better system of values, right? Or because the old standards of morality were still present in their mind. It was that they thought, that they were capable of thinking in a form of critical, self-reflective judgment. She says their criterion, I think, was a different one. They asked themselves to what extent they would still be able to live in peace with themselves after having committed certain deeds. And they decided that it would be better to do nothing, not because the world would then be changed for the better, but simply because only on this condition could they go on living with themselves at all. Hence, they also chose to die when they were forced to participate. To put it crudely, they refused to murder, not so much because they still held fast to the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," but because they were unwilling to live together with a murderer, with themselves. And so here in this final part of the argument, we see Arendt drawing together judgment and her conception of thinking. If thinking is that two-in-one conversation, as she calls it, where I alone have a conversation with myself, there's a question of moral integrity about who I want to be having that conversation with. And at the end of the day, I don't want to be having that conversation with a murderer in the example that she's giving, which reframes, I think, the colloquial phrase, what it means to live with oneself. She's really tying that conversation that we have in that self-reflective space to our capacity to judge and then act in the world and how it influences us as individual beings. And then towards the very end, she says, the dividing line between those who want to think, and therefore have to judge by themselves, and those who do not, strikes across all social and cultural or educational differences. In this respect, the total moral collapse of respectable society during the Hitler regime may teach us that under such circumstances, those who cherish values and hold fast to moral norms and standards are not reliable. Right? The people who, in let's say a liberal democratic society, which has a rule of law and a normative moral order, and the people that we would judge to be good citizens in this framework are actually end up on the other side of the moral framework in a totalitarian society. Those people who hold fast to the normative orders are actually the people that are not reliable, who are not going to do the right thing when the time comes to do the right thing. Much more reliable will be the doubters and skeptics, not because skepticism is good or doubting wholesome, but because skepticism and doubting are used to examine things and to make up one's own mind about the world. And so she ends on a note of civil disobedience, and what would happen if people disobeyed instead of just going along with orders, even when they're under the guise of legal morality. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there. There are lots of parts to the essay that I have not had time to discuss, which I hope we can pick up in our conversation on Friday, and I'm looking forward to discussing personal responsibility under dictatorship with you. Have a good week.